Hey, it's Art. Welcome back to the channel. Dynamics play a critical role in music, and so it makes perfect sense that dynamics processing plays a critical role in music production and mixing. So as producers and as mixers, it's incredibly important for us to have a working knowledge or even a mastery over the various dynamics processes available to us. One of the lesser known processes that we will discuss in this video is upward compression. So we're going to talk about how it compares to the typical downward compression that we are used to using, how it sounds different from downward compression, its different use cases, how it compares to parallel compression, and toward the end we're really going to nerd out on the technical differences or the technical sameness between it and downward compression. So before we get started, I quickly want to go over a few different definitions here. First, we have dynamic range, which is effectively the difference between the loudest part of a signal and the quietest part of a signal, followed by compression, which is the reduction of that dynamic range. Compression is also known as dynamic range compression. We have the threshold, which is the set amplitude at which the sidechain or input signal will cause the compressor to trigger. We have the ratio, which is effectively how much that compressor will act. The higher the ratio, the more compression. We have the attack time, which tells us how fast the compressor will react as the input or sidechain signal passes that threshold. And then we have the release time, which tells us how fast the compressor will disengage as that input or sidechain signal passes back across the other side of the threshold. I made each of these definitions perhaps a bit more vague than they ought to be because they are going to be a little bit different whether we are discussing the typical downward compression or upward compression. So with that, let's hop into the digital audio workstation and have a closer look at what upward compression is and how we can utilize it in our production and mixes. All right, here we are inside of Logic Pro to get a better understanding of both upward and downward compression, both visually and audibly. So I ran through all of my plugins here and I landed on iZotope's Ozone 10 Dynamics as the best plugin that I have in my arsenal to both show things visually and to actually show you inside a single plugin downward and upward compression. And so what I want to do is focus on this box right here. Unfortunately, I can't make it any bigger within the plugin itself, but you see first and foremost, we have a parallel fader right here. We're going to keep this all the way wet, so there is no original signal being passed through this plugin. It is only the compressed signal. And then I want to show you this graph in particular right here. So the x-axis right here, this is our input signal. The y-axis is our output signal. And then this line right here is how the compressor will work. And so you see the C right here, that is our compressor threshold. This also has a limiter, but you can see here that the limiter is not set. It's got a ratio of 1:1, so it's not actually going to do any limiting, and I'm going to keep that all the way up there. So the compressor threshold, that is going to be denoted by the C just to differentiate it from L up here. But again, we will not be using the limiter whatsoever in this demonstration. So we have our input on the x-axis, the output on the y-axis, and a ratio of 1:1 right here, or 1.0 to 1 in the case of the compressor, means that whatever goes into the compressor is going to be outputted from the compressor. So if we have, for example, negative 32 dBFS going in, we're going to have negative 32 dBs coming out. In other words, there's going to be no compression. Now, a ratio above 1:1 is going to give us that downward style compression. So if I bring this ratio up to 2.0 to 1 or 2 to 1, then we see what happens here on this graph. As we go up to the threshold right here, we have a 1:1, so whatever's inputted is outputted. But then after the threshold, as the input or sidechain signal goes above the threshold, we now have a situation that for every 2 dB we put in above the threshold in the input, we're only going to get 1 dB of output above that same threshold. We can increase this ratio as well up into limiting territory. Let's go maybe 20 to 1. And you see that this really flattens out. And so in this case, for every 20.1 actually decibels we go above the threshold in the input or the sidechain, we're only going to get 1 decibel of output above that same threshold. And so downward compression works to reduce the dynamic range of a signal by taking the loudest parts of the signal and bringing them down. And in that way, it is reducing the dynamic range. Again, the difference between the loudest peak and the quietest part of the signal. Now let's contrast this with upward compression. I'll bring this knee down so that we get a straighter line right here. And if we go to a ratio that is below 1:1, you can see that the graph is changing over here as I reduce the ratio. And then as I get to 1, it is a perfectly straight line. This is a 1:1 ratio again, so no compression. Then if I drop this down, you see that instead of this line flattening out, this one stays the same above the threshold, a 1:1 ratio. and what we have below the threshold is upward compression. And so now we have a case where if the signal level drops below this threshold, at this point it is negative 20 dBFS, then we are going to get this upward compression. So now we have a case with this 1:2 ratio that for every 2 dB the signal drops below the threshold, the output will only be 1 dB below that threshold. And so in this case, we are utilizing upward compression, and we are reducing the dynamic range by, instead of bringing the peaks down, we're bringing the lower levels up, and in that way reducing the dynamic range of the signal. And I can stretch this even further by bringing the ratio down even more. Let's say 1 to 10, and now we have a situation where for every 10 decibels the signal drops below the threshold, the output will only be 1 decibel below the threshold. And so this is a preliminary understanding of both downward and upward compression. If you understand how typical compression works, then this should make a lot of sense to you. Once again, the attack and release times tell us how fast a compressor will react once a signal passes that threshold, and how fast the compressor will disengage once that signal passes back across the threshold. In the case of regular compression or downward compression, the attack time is how fast the compressor will react as the signal goes above the set threshold, and the release will be how fast the compressor disengages once that signal comes back down below the set threshold. And in the case of upward compression, the attack is going to tell us how fast the compressor is going to react as the signal drops below the set threshold, and then the release is how fast the compressor will disengage after the signal goes back above the set threshold. And so that's why I kept things a little bit more nebulous in the introductory definitions of the attack and release times. Additionally, I have this knee set to 0 so that we have this hard knee. I can also soften this up, and you can see right here, if you focus in on the graph, that it's much more rounded. So we actually start getting compression a little bit above or below the threshold, depending on how you look at it, versus having the hard knee. It's exactly at the threshold. That's when things are going to start happening with the compressor. So let's not just talk about it, let's be about it and actually have a listen here to a variety of different compressor settings. We're going to have a listen to no compression, some upward compression, some downward compression, some limiting, and some very hard upward compression, just so that we can hear the differences. I'm going to keep this gain match engaged right here. That will help us to better hear the subtle differences between the different styles of compression. A/B testing with level matching, or gain matching in this case, is going to get rid of any loudness bias that we may have, where we'll automatically tend to prefer something that is louder, and it'll just help to give us a better idea of the different sonic characters of the various compressor settings. Because after all, if we are using downward compression, we're going to want to increase the makeup gain in order to make up for the gain reduction that the compressor circuit is applying. And when we're utilizing upward compression, then we're going to actually want to bring the output gain down to better match the output to the original input. So this gain match option right here in the Ozone 10 Dynamics is a great way to help us get there. And we're going to be listening to this drum loop. Here it is with no compression. And you can see that the input signal is just touching and going above the threshold a little bit. I can bring the threshold down. Now you can see that pretty much the entirety of the signal is above the threshold. Or I could bring the threshold all the way up, and you can see that it will never actually touch the threshold. So let's bring this down so that the input is passing it just a little bit, maybe 22.8 dBFS, negative 22.8. So this sounds like a normal drum track, and again, there's no compression being applied, so I will be able to toggle this on and off with gain matching, and the sound should not change whatsoever. Off. So no compression, and this is a very transparent plugin. It's a mastering plugin, and so there's no sonic change that is being applied to the signal here. I should note while we're at it that this is a single band compressor. In this Ozone 10 Dynamics, we actually have the ability to set up multiple bands and have multi-band compression, but for the purposes of this video, we are going to be focusing on a single wideband from 20 hertz all the way up to 20,000 hertz. And so knowing that, I can simply toggle this plugin on and off so that we can quickly contrast between no compression and whatever compression settings that we have going on at the moment. So first and foremost, I want to show you what really cranking up the compressor into a limiter position would do. In this case, I'm just going to bring this all the way up. We have now a 30:1 ratio. So we are going to need 30 dB above this set threshold, which would bring us well beyond clipping in order to get 1 dB above this threshold. And so this is effectively limiting. It's going to sound much different than typical compression with lower ratio settings. We can have a listen to this on the drum track. And I'm actually going to toggle this trace view so that we can see the amount of gain reduction being applied. So here we go. So we're getting a little bit gain reduction, maybe 8 dB. I can bring down the threshold to get more. There you can really hear it. And you can see here that we are applying gain in order to gain match. No compression, no limiting, limiting. So it really crushes the signal. You can bring up the attack, maybe allow some more of those transients through. Just the release. Now we're getting a bit more than 10 dB of gain reduction. You can see the gain reduction up here. I can make it snappier by reducing the release. Transients of the snare are a little bit smeared. The overall drums sound squashed. So we can bring down the attack, get more pumping, a shorter attack and a longer release. Allow more transients through with a longer attack. Now the transient of the snare is not as smeared. We can really ruin the signal by going really fast. This kind of reduces the quality. And then we can really get the effect of squashing the drums with longer attack and release times. So that is effectively limiting. Now we can move on to regular compression. Let's go to a ratio of, say, 4:1, much more manageable. So now for every 4 dB we go above this set threshold in the input, 1 dB is going to be outputted above that threshold. And so this isn't going to sound as noticeable, but I'll just quickly run through the same attack and release settings. I'll adjust the threshold as need be. We can have a listen to a more typical ratio for compression. Versus the limiting, less crushed, versus no compression. You can definitely hear it. Bring down these settings. Let more transients through with a longer attack. More pumping, and we can also get lackluster results by having really short attack and release times versus no compression. So that is downward limiting and downward compression, or typical limiting and compression. You'll notice there that it's the heavy transient parts of the drum kit in this example, the snare and the kick, that are really causing the compressor to trigger. Those are the peaks in the audio that are surpassing the set threshold, and then the compressor or the limiter is going to bring them down in level. So again, it's the strong peaks that are triggering the compressor. And so with upward compression, we can almost expect the opposite. We can expect the noise floor to trigger the compressor, when there's not anything going on, or the cymbals and the less transient parts of the kit, in this case, to trigger the upward compression. So we will likely be bringing up the cymbals and the overall room while leaving the strong transients, the kick and the snare, alone. So let's start off with a ratio of 1:2 and just mess around with these settings, and I'll describe what I'm doing as we go through. So here it is with a 1:2 ratio. See that we're no longer getting this gain reduction meter right here, but we do see these little blue dots where there's actually no gain applied to the signal. You can see in the gain match that we're actually reducing our gain rather than giving gain to the signal, because of course the upward compression is adding to the signal. Let's get a more noticeable effect by bringing up this threshold. Without. So you hear more of the room sound, more noise in the signal. And almost more sustain on the snare and on the hats. And while it's not necessarily affecting the peaks of the transients of the kick and the snare, it is affecting their overall tone, and it really sounds like it's actually slamming the drums, even though technically speaking, it's supposed to be leaving those peaks alone. Now, this, of course, is going to be dependent largely on the attack and the release times, so we have to look at these almost in reverse from the downward compression. So again, the attack time is going to be how fast the compressor is going to add gain as the input signal drops below the threshold, and the release is going to be how fast that gain application of the compressor is reduced, or the compressor disengages as the signal goes above the threshold. And so at longer release times, we are actually still applying gain to the initial peaks of the snare or the kick drum in this example of the kit. And so we aren't actually going to be leaving those peaks alone. This is where things get a little bit more complicated. And if we were to bring the release and the attack down, then we heard in the case of downward compression that is going to give us lackluster results, as the compressor doesn't really know how to react. It's going to try to act instantaneously, and that just doesn't work with compression. That's more of a wave shaping thing, and we can especially hear it when dealing with upward compression. Here's what this sounds like. So a lot of distortion, a lot of wave shaping almost, as the upward compressor tries to react instantaneously as the input signal goes above and below the set threshold. So we can't really have that. Without sounds good, with not so good. So we have to bring these time parameters back a little bit, and then therefore we get an altering of the initial peaks of the kick and snare, even though technically they are not supposed to be affecting these peaks. And so we do get a lot more of that low-level signal as to be expected, the cymbals and the overall room ambience. That's a great reason to utilize upward compression. But at the same time, the whole idea that it is not going to affect the initial peaks at all is kind of a misnomer, because we have to take into account the attack and the release times. The same thing is true of downward compression, but I find it particularly noticeable on upward compression. Maybe it's because my ears are much more used to downward compression, and I can expect how different settings will work, and I'm not as used to upward compression, but I digress. And we pushed downward compression into limiting, so let's push upward compression as far as it can go in the case of Ozone 10 Dynamics. We now have a ratio of 1:10, and so in this case, as the input signal drops below the threshold, it will have to go below the threshold by 10 dB in order for the output of the compressor to be 1 dB below the same threshold. This is what this sounds like. Let's try to get more natural transients. And you hear that distortion. And And then as I bring the release up, it's really applying a lot of that gain. A lot of that leftover gain is being applied to the initial peaks of the snare and the kick. And you can see that in order to get a gain match here, we're actually bringing down the gain quite significantly. A lot of distortion with short attack and release times. And then really crushed. We can compare that to no compression. And with. And now what does it sound like compared to hard limiting? So to my ears, the upward style compression when we're pushing it really hard to a 1:10 ratio versus hard limiting with a 30:1 ratio, the upward compression actually sounds like it's crushing the signal more. It's bringing up a lot of that low end energy while still, to my ears, really crushing those transients on the kick and the snare. So that's my demonstration of downward versus upward compression and how it looks and how it sounds, particularly on drums. But we aren't only working with drums when we are producing music. So I figured it's important to show you something with fewer dynamics, or at least dynamics that aren't as intense. So let's hop into another session and have a look and listen to upward and downward compression on vocals. All right, here we are in the next session, and you see that I have the Ozone 10 dynamics now on the lead vocal. This is for a track by Lukey called Seasonally. And when I had the upward compression applied to the drums in the previous example, a lot of the nuance came up, the hats, the overall room tone. It also helped to increase the overall sustain of the kick and the snare, even though it did tend to squash those elements. And of course, it helped to reduce the dynamic range. And so on vocals right here, we can expect it to do similar things. We can expect it to increase the nuance, so the breath noise between vocal takes, the subtleties of the vocal character, and the like. So we can have a listen to the vocal by itself to start off. I will solo this. Here it is without any upward compression.
Do have to sweat all day, drink that river dry bed, because I know monsoon's coming like the tide in.
And here it is now with an upward compressor with a ratio of 1:3 and the following attack, release, and knee settings. I have the threshold set to negative 23.2 dBFS, and we can toggle between having upward compression and no compression, and I'll move around a few of these parameters to get a better idea of what this will be doing. Pay special attention to the nuance and the character of the vocal.
Do have to sweat all day, drink that river dry bed, because I know monsoon's coming like the tide in. I would do.
So the breaths are definitely brought up. Here's the beginning once again without.
Do have to sweat all day.
And with.
Do have to sweat all day, drink that river dry bed, because I know monsoon.
You can hear it especially between those vocals right there.
Dry bed, because I know monsoon.
And with.
Drink that river dry bed, because I know monsoon.
But along with the increase in level on that breath between the takes, we're also getting a bunch of that room noise.
Dry bed, because I know monsoon's coming like.
And so this is kind of the pros and the cons of utilizing any type of compression, but especially upward compression. And so it helps to increase some of the character. You heard there at the very beginning that perhaps the time parameters are a little bit wonky because it kind of sounds a bit off as the vocal is coming in. Here's without.
Do have to sweat all day.
And with.
Do have to sweat all day, drink that river.
Seems like there's a little bit of a volume jump that shouldn't be there if I bring up these parameters.
Do have to sweat all day, drink that river dry bed.
It's a bit more smoothed out. Let's bring down the threshold so that we are actually peaking above the threshold.
Do have to sweat all day, drink that river dry bed, because I know monsoon.
And so it takes a little bit of finessing in order to get something that really flows really nicely. You heard that the breath really jumped out and then it got clamped down really quick.
Do have to sweat all day, drink that river dry bed, because I know monsoon's coming like the tide in. I would do it seasonally if you...
So a longer attack may be required for this particular vocal. And again, it's critical to note that it's in the attack and release times that we really get a lot of the character out of any compression, not only upward compression, but also downward compression. So let's have a listen to this vocal with and without this upward compression in the context of the mix.
Do have to sweat all day, drink that river dry bed, because I know monsoon's coming like the tide in. I would do it seasonally if you wanted me to.
And so I would have to make this a lot more subtle, maybe go to a 1.7 ratio rather than a 3.
Do have to sweat all day, drink that river dry bed, because I know monsoon's coming like the...
So that it's not as intense and so that the compressor isn't triggering as hard as it goes below and then back above the set threshold here. I should note as well that I stripped a lot of silence between the vocal tracks, and so that will give us points where there's absolute silence and then the vocal comes in, which can very much be accentuated by upward compression, because again, we are going from no signal, therefore no compression, to a bit of signal, which is going to cause the compressor to really ramp up the gain, especially at higher settings right here. So if I was to crank this downward and go from silence to signal, it could sound like this.
Do have to sweat all day, drink...
Not the biggest deal because I think I did a fairly good job crossfading, but if we listen to going out versus coming in,
Oh,
you heard a little bit of a digital click there at the end,
oh,
which may not be as audible without this compression.
oh.
Still there, just not as noticeable. That's kind of getting into the weeds, but be very careful when utilizing any form of upward compression when there may be any digital pops. Be sure to use your crossfades and all that when you're doing your editing for that reason. While we're here, I should note as well that for this demonstration, I am sending the vocal to bus 4. You see, I actually turned off the compressor that I was using on the actual mix, and on bus 4 over here on the actual vocal bus, I turned off the compressors there too. So we are only hearing, in this case, the upward compression on the vocal itself. I am applying some limiting here on the mix bus, and I suppose with this Saturn II, a little bit of subtle saturation will apply some downward compression to the signal, but I just wanted to be clear and transparent over what other processing I am using on the vocal in this case, so that you understand better that you're hearing upward compression and not a bunch of downward compression that's happening after the fact. And speaking of the mix bus, we can actually utilize a bit of upward compression on the mix bus if we really wanted to. Let's again get rid of this limiter, make that ratio 1:1, and have a listen to what a bit of upward compression may sound like on the mix bus. Now, in this case, again, we are going through some limiters. This is mostly to get some more loudness out of the mix, but regardless, let's have a listen to a bit of upward compression going into these limiters on the entirety of the mix. And actually, before we do this, I want to turn off especially such an intense upward compression on the lead vocal. I'm going to turn that off, actually re-engage the compressor I had right here. Now let's have a listen to a bit of upward compression on the mix bus itself.
Do it seasonally if you wanted me
See that we're dancing around the threshold. Without. With. So So it's subtle. I'm only really bringing up maybe 10 dB at the very maximum. Again, I am gain matching so that we can get a better A/B comparison, but it just helps to bring up a little bit of the nuance, especially in the drums and the overall ambience of the track. One common process, particularly on the mix bus, is to actually utilize the multiband aspects of these plugins. So for example, if I was to create 3 bands right here, then I could focus my efforts primarily on the mid band and bring this ratio down, let's say 2, and actually get rid of any compression downward or upward in the upper and lower ranges. And then in this way, I can accentuate and give a little bit more energy, or at least bring up the nuance of this mid-range right here. Let's have a listen to what this sounds like. It's a bit too much.
And I would sweat all day, drink that river dry bed, because I know monsoon.
Very much a balancing game. Maybe just subtle. Versus nothing.
Sorry about yesterday. I was stuck in my bed. I was picturing you.
Anyway, we aren't going to get super in-depth into mastering or mix bus processing in this video. I just wanted to show you a few different ways of utilizing upward compression. So we had a look at drums, at vocals, at the mix bus, and then a bit more advanced techniques with multiband, or in this case, single narrow band upward compression on the mix bus. Again, I would take some time to actually dial this in. You heard there that it can be pretty intense when not wielded properly, and it can be very subtle to add in a little bit more energy when used a little bit more subtly, as I did toward the ending of my altering of these settings down here. And so this brings us to the question of when to utilize downward compression versus upward compression. So downward compression, I would typically use to make levels more consistent, particularly with vocals. If I really want the vocals to sit up front in the mix, I would usually grab or gravitate toward downward compression to really help make them sit at the forefront of the mix. The great thing about downward compression, in my opinion, is that it can make things like vocals that we want sitting up front in the mix be more consistently up front, while also making things that we want to sit more distant in the mix more consistently toward the back of the mix. Personally, because I've used downward compression so much, I know different compressors have different sonic characters, not only in their gain reduction circuits, but in their overall character. We've been utilizing the Ozone 10 here, which is very transparent. It doesn't add a whole lot of color, but there are plenty of, especially hardware compressors that have a lot of character that I really like. And of course, I like to utilize downward compression to help manage the peaks and help to reduce clipping. More often than not, I will opt for limiting, that is compression with a very high ratio, in order to achieve this goal. But that is typically what I would utilize downward compression for. And then in the case of upward compression, which admittedly I don't use a whole lot of, I would tend to reach for that style of compression to bring up the nuance of a track, either the ghost notes or the overall ambience of a recording, or even if a signal has baked in reverb or delay, I could utilize upward compression to help bring that out, paying special attention not to bring up that noise floor too much. Or alternatively, I could utilize it to increase the perceived sustain of different notes, particularly more transient notes like kicks and snares. So I know that understanding the typical use cases is very important. I just wanted to give you some insight into what I would personally utilize downward versus upward compression in my mixes for. And when I say I don't typically utilize upward compression, I'm talking about actual upward compressors like this one, where I actually set a 1 to something greater than 1 ratio. However, I do often utilize parallel compression, which effectively gives us a similar result, if not the same result. And so I wanted to show you this again on the vocal and on drums, so we can bypass this mix bus upward compression and go back to the lead vocal here. Let's start from the beginning. So right here, I have this vocal that is being upward compressed. We can open up our trusty Ozone 10 dynamics. You can see here that we have a ratio of 1 to 3, an attack time of 20 milliseconds, a release time of 3 milliseconds, and a hard knee. And then in this vocal, I have the same exact vocal, the same exact audio signal right here, the same gain settings, the same EQ. I do not have the Ozone 10 engaged on this insert. And then we have more gain there that is equal. And then I have this track being sent to bus 30, which comes in on this parallel track, which is being mixed underneath this original. And what I have on the parallel track is some parallel compression, where I'm actually borderline limiting the signal. It's a ratio of 10:1, so we are getting downward compression. The attack time is 20 milliseconds. The release time is 37 milliseconds with a hard knee. And so as we discussed with upward compression, we are effectively raising the level of the low-level signals below a set threshold, and we're leaving the top signals alone. Of course, we now understand that the attack and release times of an upward compressor will give a little bit more signal to any signals that pass above the set threshold and take away a little bit more as the signal drops below the threshold, just as the compressor reacts to the changing signal level. And the same thing is true in downward compression, but with parallel compression, we have a situation where we have a completely dry track, so no compression being added to the original track. We have this 1:1, if you want to call it that. And then with the parallel signal that is being mixed underneath it, we have a lot of downward compression. And so when we combine these two signals, we are going to get more signal added below the set threshold than we do above the set threshold of the parallel channel, which effectively gives us a sort of upward compression. So I hope that that makes sense. Again, we are beholden to the attack and the release times. For example, if I had a very long attack time in this parallel compressor, then that would allow some of those initial transients to poke through, which would add even more signal to the overall mix of the dry and the parallel compressed channel. Much like an upward compressor may not return to a 1:1 ratio as the signal passes back up beyond the set threshold. So there's a lot of similarities. We can actually have a listen to the differences between these two. Again, I will open up this Ozone for the original upward compressor on the first vocal. We can have a listen to this first vocal.
To have to work this hard.
It's actually pretty squash. Bring this ratio up to 2.
Because to have to work this hard. I don't
now
even
the
mind
parallel.
it. To have to work this hard, I don't even mind it.
The upward.
To have to work this hard. To have to work this hard, I don't even.
So they certainly sound a little bit different, but we are getting a very similar effect. So once again, this is the upward compressor. This is acting on this channel. Same exact audio signal. And then if we were to go to this channel, you can see that it's going to be sending to this Vox parallel, and then that's going to be feeding into the signal as well.
To have to work this hard,
See both
I don't
signals?
even mind it.
And here's the upward compressor.
To have to work this hard, I don't even mind it.
So the overall tonality and character of the vocal is very much the same once the vocal is present. The big difference is at the very start of the vocal where that initial breath comes in, because this upward compressor is really going to drive that up compared to the reaction of the parallel compressor adding to the dry signal. So that's the big difference that I hear, and I hope that that demonstration was useful for showing you audibly the similarities between upward compression and parallel compression. Again, personally, I set up and utilize parallel compression over reaching for upward compressors, but that's more so a personal choice. Perhaps the biggest advantage over having parallel compression is that I now have this completely independent channel, so I can automate this over the course of the mix if I wanted to. Of course, I can do that inside the upward compressor as well with this wet dry control, so it's not a big deal. But getting back to this independent control, in addition to the compression that I'm adding on this parallel channel, I can also apply EQ, I can apply saturation, I can apply any other effects to this channel and have it act completely independently from the dry channel, which is a luxury I don't really have if I'm opting to utilize only upward compression to get a similar effect. So that is it on vocals. Let's hop back and have a quick listen on drums, and then we'll get into the more nerdy details of really technically comparing upward and downward compression. All right, here we are back in the first session we started on to have a look at drums, and I have them bounced out as audio. You can see that I'm applying some upward compression just ever so slightly, and then I have this other one that is being sent to a parallel compressor. That parallel compressor comes in here, and I'm using this same plugin, once again, very transparent, a high ratio, 10:1, and just really crushing this bus before mixing it back in with the parallel channel. Just to prove that these two channels are indeed the same, I'm going to phase invert the second one and have a listen to them at both the same level. They should completely cancel out. So they are indeed the same signal. So now let's have a listen to the upward only versus the parallel back to back. Here is the upward only. I'll try to find a good place to put these. Not the easiest with one screen. So here's the parallel compressor up here. You can see that I am sending there. I'll try to keep the mixer open and we can have a listen back to back. So here's upward. See that the compressor is indeed working. Here's the parallel. See that the parallel bus right here is really crushing that signal. Back to the upward. A little bit of a volume difference. Let's bring up the parallel to try to match. Here we go. Very similar. Upward. And so you hear the similarities between these two. Again, one just involves setting up a effects return channel right here, which I prefer doing because it gives me more opportunities and more flexibility in the music production and mixing. I actually have a video I did last week that's basically a creative masterclass on utilizing your routing and your effects returns more specifically. I'll leave a card to that up here and a link to that in the description box down below if you're interested in checking that out. So that wraps up the bulk of our look and listen at upward compression and how it compares to downward compression. Now what I really want to do is address the math behind it, because effectively upward compression and downward compression are the same thing, and yet they sound so different and they are used differently in mixing and music production. If we look at upward and downward compression, we can think of downward compression as simply turning down the level of a signal as it surpasses a set threshold and then applying some makeup gain to make up for the signal lost. And then upward compression, we're simply turning up the volume as a signal drops below a set threshold and then bringing down the makeup gain in order to achieve the same volume. And so theoretically, if we had two signals that were exactly the same, we put an upward compressor on one, a downward compressor on the other, matched their thresholds, made sure that their ratios were opposite but equal, and that the attack time of one was the same as the release time of the other, and vice versa, then we would have a situation where the compressors themselves would be applying the same compression, whether they are downward or upward, and those same two signals, if they were to be phase flipped, would cancel each other out. So I wanted to address that here, and spoiler alert, if we don't have any dynamics in a signal, this is going to be the case, but the real difference between the use cases of a downward versus an upward compressor is that the actual audio signals that they act on themselves are not completely mirrored as they pass above or below the set threshold. We're going to see in a second that this is the case with a simple undynamic signal, but it is not the case with actual complex waveforms that we actually work with in music production and mixing. And so here is the test we are going to run quickly. I have two signals here. They are both sine waves, sine wave test A, sine wave test B. I have this gain plugin on sine test B. By the way, these are both mono sine waves. I have the phase invert right here, which means that if these two signals are exactly the same, which they are, we will not get any output because their phases are flipped. So no output there, even though they are both certainly outputting their own signals in their own right. If I turn this gain off so that the polarity is no longer flipped on the second, we will get a doubling of signal level. Flip the phase of one, we lose it all. Now on this first one, I'm going to insert this Ozone 10 dynamics. Let's bring this up here. So we have sine test A. This is a downward compressor with a ratio of 10:1, an attack of 22 milliseconds, a release of 60 milliseconds, and the threshold is -20. Let's open up this other Ozone right here, which is an upward compressor. This one has a ratio of 10, an attack of 60, and a release of 22 with a hard knee. So we have equal but opposite attack and release, equal and opposite ratio, and a threshold of 20 on either. In this downward compressor, we have our threshold set at -20 with a ratio of 10 to 1. So the input signal right here, -10, so that's 10 dB above this threshold. And so once I engage this compressor, I should get -19 output from the signal. Because the compressor is in line, we should see this number right here, the actual peak output, change to -19. Let's be sure to turn this gain match off and have a listen. So beyond that initial peak, I'm getting roughly -19. This isn't going to be perfect. It's -18.7. But we can say that it is close enough for these testing purposes. Now, sine wave B, if I was to open this Ozone up, be sure to turn off the gain match. This one, I also have an output of 10. Remember that these are exactly the same because they cancel each other out. Now with -10, this is well above this compressor's -20 threshold. And so with this upward compressor turned on, I should have the same exact level because again, above that threshold, we have a 1-to-1 ratio. So if I play this back, we have that -10. So now in order to get these at the same level, again, if I was to play both of these back, once again, I wish I could make these a bit smaller, but I cannot. If I was to play both of these back, one of them would be at -19, -18.7, and the other would be at -10. And so in order to get these at the same level, I could take sine test A and either bring this gain up or bring the gain of sine test B down. Let's bring this one down because we are dealing with quite a bit of level. So let's bring this down by -8.7. And you hear that we now have these at the same exact level. Now, if I was to hit this switch, it would completely cancel each other out once again. So we have one that is being processed by a downward compressor, one that's being processed by an upward compressor, and then we're turning down the gain a little bit, and we are completely canceling these signals out. Now, the interesting thing, I'm going to exit out of these entirely. So we have a fixed gain reduction on the upward compressor, no gain reduction or makeup gain in the downward compressor. And now to prove that the ratios will be equal to any linear change in gain, let's open up these two gains. And what I'm doing is I am bringing down each of these test signals by 20 decibels. And so again, with these two turned on, the dynamics now bypassed. Phase inverting one will lead to no output, because they are exactly the same. And now if I turn the downward and the upward compressor on and play this back, you'll hear that there is a little bit of signal. That is just because these are not absolutely perfect. So if I actually went to gain match this one and on this one so that we have true gain matching, then the signal would cancel out. No phase invert, doubling of signal volume. And so in a perfect world, simply having makeup gain or lack thereof would be enough. But again, the math didn't work out perfectly. For example, we had -18.7 dB rather than -19, even though we have a hard knee and a compressor ratio of 10 to 1. And then as we were to drop below the signal, we should have, with a -30 dB signal coming into here, -21 because of this -10 to 1 ratio. And if I was to actually play this back without any gain reduction, we actually have -20.8 rather than the expected -21. So the math isn't perfect, but if it were, I wouldn't actually have to use the gain match right here. I would actually set this to the proper -9, and they would completely cancel each other out. Now, the important thing to note here is that this is a sine wave. It's an undynamic signal, meaning that there's no real fluctuations in its level. Of course, it does have a waveform. It's a single frequency waveform that we can actually see right here, but there's no peaks as there are in actual complex waveforms, such as these drums right here. And so what happens in these complex waveforms is that the rate at which a signal level will surpass a set threshold is not always going to mirror the rate at which it drops back down below that set threshold. This is true of going above and below. And so what this means is even if we have opposite ratios, the same exact threshold, gain matching, and opposite attack and release times, we are going to get differences between how upward compression and downward compression actually react to a signal. And so what I want to do here is close out these sine wave tests and focus our energy on these drum tracks right here. So once again, without any dynamics processing, we will get a doubling level because they are exactly the same. And if I was to phase invert one of them, complete cancellation. And now on the first one, I can actually rename this drum test A, drum test B. If I was to insert this same 10:1 ratio downward compressor, 20 dB threshold with 22 millisecond attack, 60 millisecond release, and then contrast that with this one right here, which is equal and opposite as an upward compressor, we would have these two tracks. Maybe alter these so that we don't have the upward compressor working as hard or much harder than the downward compressor. Let's go -30. So now we have both of them working. And again, we have our gain matching turned on. And now if we were to phase invert one of them, you hear that they are definitely not the same. That is because of how these two react. Even if I was to make the attack and the release all the same time, all around, tightens it up, but it's still not the same. Even if I was to take the attack and release down all the way, I should get closer, theoretically. But because it introduces so much distortion, it actually makes the phase cancellation even worse. So yes, mathematically speaking, in an ideal world, upward compression and downward compression are identical. However, we do not live in an ideal world, and the audio signals that we work on in our music production and mixing are going to be very complex. If they were all simple sine waves, then things wouldn't be very interesting. And so downward and upward compression show up differently in the real world when we actually utilize them. In addition to the lack of mirroring that happens as complex waveforms surpass and then drop down below a set threshold, and the actual attack and release times and how these two compressors react to the changing signal levels, we also have a case in many compressors that they actually add harmonic saturation and their own quote-unquote character to the sound. Of course, we're dealing with Ozone 10, which is very transparent. That's partly why I chose this plugin for the demonstrations. But that is yet another thing to take into consideration, is that typical compressors have their own inherent character, which will also color how they process different audio tracks. And so choosing one compressor for your downward compression and then another compressor for your upward compression is likely to give even more differences in results than something very transparent like the Ozone 10 dynamics. And so if you've made it this far into the video, I'd like to thank you for being here and nerding out a little bit with me. I just really wanted to cover how they are the same theoretically, but they are not actually the same when we put them into practice. If you did like this video, I would encourage you to hit that like button and also to subscribe here to the Mighty Microphone YouTube channel, where I share a whole bunch of knowledge on mixing and music production. I have another video that's going to show up on this end card that I would suggest you watch next if you would like some more information here. So click on that one and I'll see you there. Cheers.